About a year ago, we finally got the announcement that the Victoria 3 was finally coming out. It also announced that there will be substantial changes in how the warfare system will be working. Fast forward a couple of months in November 2021, and we finally get a little bit more glimpse in how the system will be implemented, but it's not really clear. There's still a lot of subjective areas on how it will be playing in the game. Fast forward another couple months into early April 2022, and we get the infamous Victoria 3 Beta Leak, where we can see in full how this military system will be implemented. But before we even think about talking about the current military system that has been implemented, we ought to have a little bit more context to understand what's going on. First, we can jump back 16 years and dive into Victoria 1 military system. It's very similar to what was available in Europa Universalis, Crusader Kings 1. Play with chess pieces of varying sizes. You have different type of units that will give you modifier during the combat. The terrain will allow you to get bonus or maluses to your attack and defense, and you will be able to attribute generals to each of these chess piece units that will have more modifier, providing different effects to your troops. The manpower was substantially different from other titles from Paradox. Here we could literally just pump up the army to full strength in a single click, but the budget system, rather than just reducing the morale, was reducing the total available number of men in a unit. So it was a certain compromise into what would be a game that bridges the gap between Europa Universalis and Hearts of Iron. In Victoria 2, the military system is somewhat very similar. Of course, we do have technologies eventually that come into play that allow the player to have more modifiers, but generally speaking, we have standard Paradox implementation of battles. So what is the problem with the system that was implemented in Vic 1 and 2? It is a game that gaps Europa Universalis and Hearts of Iron. If we go back in history all the way to Imperator Rome, and we start scaling back into Crusader Kings timeline to Europa Universalis, well, warfare never changed. Military plans have always been laid out in a similar fashion. You would have usually one huge army with all its support units campaigning against an enemy, and eventually you'd be facing off the massive enemy army into an all-out battle. Once the battle is done, one side retreats, the other side is victorious, and the war is pretty much over. And this statement holds true when we start into Victoria. 1836, not too far from the Napoleonic Wars, where the armies fought in a very similar fashion to what we've seen throughout the entirety of history. These were the first and second generation of warfare. And then when we got to the Victorian era, we started going through the third generation, when warfare went from being able to see the person you kill to shooting and destroying them without any doubt, long-range artillery or full automatic machine gun fire. You look at the Great War, which is inside Victoria's timeline. More specifically, look at the Western Front, we can see this happen. At the start of the war, both sides thought that it will be a quick war. They would fight it off in the field, just like the Franco-Prussian War. One side will be totally victorious, the other side will be utterly destroyed, and everybody will be back by Christmas for the next war. But turns out, after facts, we realized that it's not quite how it played out. So initially, the strong fortification of the Maginot Line were heavily bombarded. The German troops tried to surround the French by going through the lowlands, but the French tried to do the same thing to encircle them from the north, and this kept going on until they reached the sea. From there was evidently no way to outmaneuver the enemy, and the only real possible strategy that could be applied at that moment, taking into account the massive change in the armament and the high lethality of the new weapons being deployed, was to dig holes in the ground in trenches, trying to survive and shoot down the enemy. This became a gridlock that would not move for almost 4 years from that point on. Millions of people have died in this front, and yet victories were counted by the inches. If we look at Victoria 1 and 2, there's simply no way to simulate that into the warfare. In addition, if you take into account the new development in armored vehicles, aerial planes, it's just not possible to include that in the battle system that was there. If you look at Hearts of Iron, they did away with the limitation of the EU system to implement a more wargame-like strategy to deploy your units. While this would be fitting for a system that will simulate World War I, where you can have semi-permanent gridlocks of units fighting out each other, air units being used for reconnaissance, for bombardment, just not viable at the start of the game. So now we have a conundrum where it is more apt to be using a system akin to Hearts of Iron. So what do you do? Right? For Victoria 1, Victoria 2, the solution I think was quite simplistic, although successful in its implementation. They went all out with the European system. Using that system, ensure that the early game is within the frame of what we're expecting the warfare to be playing out. Anyway, how many players do actually reach the end of a Victoria 2 campaign or Victoria 1 campaign? I'd say probably not that many, and most of them that do get to that point, the warfare changes is just set of modifiers on your troops fighting out battles. It's not really a massive impact as it should have been, but it's just not representative of the gravity of war for the Victorian period. Now, Victoria 3 wanted to change that radically, so the system they implemented is extremely abstract out of the actual tactical fighting. Current implementation we've seen from the beta is that you will have different fronts facing your enemies, and you'd be able to attribute generals and armies to these fronts. They will subsequently automatically deal with the fighting at the tactical level, so you only really have a very macro vision, which if we go back and look at how the German Empire was doing in the early 20th century, will be fairly accurate. The Kaiser himself did not even start the First World War, right? The real first engagement between German troops and Russian troops in the East was German general taking initiative, thinking that they would be able to have a quick defeat of the Russian troops and conquer the land before really anybody understood what was going on. So they act with utmost autonomy in that level, and that's something that could be easily represented with the frontline system, right? Once you set the generals, they can decide, okay, it could be a good moment to do an attack, to do an assault, because as a general I perceive a potential enemy weakness and we have to exploit that. I can see that as a gameplay wise mechanic that will not be ideal, because usually the player wants as much micro control in the macro functions as possible. So I had to think very thoroughly at how this implemented beta system could be upgraded so the huge leap we're taking from Victoria 1 and 2 system into Victoria 3 is successful. I think something akin to the battle line plans would be something interesting. Right now in the system we set the borders, generals do their thing, and you eventually win the war or you lose, but you don't really have much of an impact. I think if we're able to direct the attention of the front lines, which way we want them to penetrate the enemy land, where do we want them to have a concentrated artillery fire, just by setting up a plan with little lines overlays, with little targets overlays where we want them to pocket the enemy resistance. I think it will be a great improvement over what we have. It will allow the player to have much more engagement in the battle. But you know, it's not easy to implement a new system when players have a high expectation of what it should be. The thing really is, after what we've seen, the era of changes going from ancient to modern warfare just cannot realistically be modelized by a single system that we've seen in previous iterations from Paradox. Even if we go through order different games, they're really not any grand strategy game that had a moment where warfare radically changed. So really we're into innovative new grounds, and we need to find a solution. Right now, the implementation that's coming, I think, could be working out. Not ideal, but it's a great framework for future expansion into it. But I do wonder, what do you think of Victoria 3? It's a good idea that we're moving towards something new? Or would you rather have something more classic in line with what we've known from Paradox? Make sure to let me know in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and see you